I was really bashful around strangers. I simply couldn't communicate with them. Additionally, I discovered that drinking helped me relax. You know, I got really gregarious and the barriers fell away. That's what I began. And well, it took me a while to move on from it. I receive a lot of letters from folks who claim that suddenly they didn't feel embarrassed to acknowledge that they had a drinking issue and they received assistance. I'm quite proud of it, then, was able to assist others. In the past 3 years, Dick Van DJK has nearly died 3 times. 10 years. Once in a car that was on fire. On the ground, they used to crawl during wildfires. But every time, something amazing occurred. He is married to a woman at the age of 99, his granddaughter, but yet too young. He continues to exercise more than the majority of 30-year-olds. Additionally, he recently disclosed his covert strategy for reaching 100. At nearly 100 years old, what he's doing is so stunning that even his closest friends find it hard to believe. The birth date of Dick Van DJK was December 13, 1925, in West Plains, Missouri, a small town. His father, Lauren, was a door-to-door salesperson, and his mother, Hazel, was a stenographer. Back then, they had very little. Lauren's weekly income was roughly $26, which would be about $400 today. Less than 5,000 individuals lived in the town, and things were difficult. But Dick was indelibly changed by something about his small-town existence. It provided him with a straightforward charm and unwavering work ethic that persisted even after he eventually became among the most well-known figures in Hollywood. The family later relocated to Danville, Illinois. Things became fascinating. At that point, in the late 1930s, while attending high school, and Dick found himself surrounded by future celebrities in the early 1940s. O'Connor Donald, who had went to school with him and later danced in Singing in the Rain. Bobby Short did the same, who would rise to fame in New York as a vocalist. Additionally, Gene Hackman's cousin was one of his closest pals. In a classroom at least, 3 would become national celebrities out of a school body of little under 200. Such a likelihood is quite uncommon. However, it gave Dick the impression that he might perhaps accomplish something significant. Prior to taking the stage, Dick believed that he would become a minister. They never missed Sunday church thanks to his mother. When he was 15, he ever delivered a sermon. He enjoyed the thought of improving people's moods. Once, he said he aspired to make others happy the way his pastor did each week. However, then came school productions. Everything changed when he began to act. A drama instructor inspired him to perform, and his desire to become a preacher gradually dwindled. The world nearly missed his singing and dancing on screen. Something else almost prevented him from performing. Doctors informed him at the age of 16 that he had a murmur in the heart. That meant no football, no running, and no sports whatsoever. It was devastating information. However, he was unable to participate in athletics, so he enrolled in acting class. He landed his first part, Bat Tumble, and a sudden realization struck. He got the impression from the applause that he never forget. The illness that initially seemed to be a curse ended up being the why he discovered the stage. In 1944, just 2 years later, Dick made a decision that astounded everyone. He attempted to enlist in the military during World War II after dropping out of high school. However, at just 130 pounds and 6'1", he didn't weigh enough to qualify. He made 3 unsuccessful attempts. The 141 pounds was the minimum. He thus continued to eat bananas until he eventually passed away. 4th attempt, he never saw combat even then. Rather, he amused soldiers. At home he didn't care about it. All he wanted to do was assist, and he had no intention of giving up. Dick's dream after being admitted was to fly aircraft. However, that dream was short. Due to analogy, he found combat impossible, and his performance in drills was poor. He became a radio announcer as a result. The method by which he was hired was almost absurd. At a base near Sherman, Texas, while using the restroom, and he was given a piece of paper by the officer, who instructed him to read it. His audition was that. In an instant, he became the voice of the flight time program. That bathroom moment was as odd as that was the beginning of a career that would reach millions of people. Dick didn't end there. Radio, he transitioned into the entertainment division of the military, constructing sets and participating in stage productions. He sprinted, comedy shows, music, and even jokes were broadcast over the mess's loudspeakers. Although these brief, tumultuous performances lacked glamour, they taught him how to remain confident and think quickly. They also showed him how to establish a connection with a crowd, wherever he might be. After several years, those same abilities would carry him through movies and television. Following the conclusion of the war in 1946, Dick went back home. At the age of 21, he accepted a position spinning records on W-Dan, his local radio program. He entertained families with music, jokes, and competitions. Throughout the entire town, it provided him with a platform, but it wasn't a major position. Individuals become familiar with his voice. He was not yet famous, but he was on the verge of becoming so. Failure followed. Rather than immediately entering the entertainment industry, Dyke attempted to establish a Danville advertising firm. It was short-lived. In a year, the company failed. He suffered a financial loss. He became insecure. It might have come to an end. Everything, however, that defeat marked a sea change. Desperate, he joined forces with a pal, Phil. A comedy duet will be formed by Erickson. That single choice put him on the course to amusement. They performed the act of Eric and Van the Merry Mutes together, which relied entirely on comedy and mime music, with no spoken words. As everyone, they lip-synced 2 old albums, pursued punchlines, and used body language. Take the laughs. They began at nightclubs on the West Coast and continued traveling. More than 5 years. That amounts to over 2,000 nights of non-stop performance, non-stop journeying, and continuous practice. They even appeared on the first television show, and mime acts were uncommon in Atlanta. According to Van DJK, this period of time sharpened everything. His endurance, timing, and ease with a live audience even before his name was known. The 12th of February 1948. Something on live radio, something strange occurred. Dyke Van DJK and Marjorie Willett, his girlfriend, wedded in front of 15 million people. They were impoverished, and the National Bride and Groom radio program promised to cover their honeymoon and wedding expenses if they agreed to exchange vows in person. Thus they did. To a room full of strangers, a preacher, and microphones made it official. It was an early look at the potential blending of entertainment and reality. On television, the union delivered them for children and lasted for 36 years. Long before reality television, Van DJK and Willett experienced one of the first and most well-publicized instances of turning wedding drama into a business. Van DJK ended up working for WDSU in New Orleans in the early 1950s. The first television station in the city was TV Channel 6. He had a modest beginning. He performed comic sketches, hosted music events, and made announcements. He had occupied airtime during the midday news broadcast on the channel. It was a trailblazing station. It thereafter became the first to broadcast in color in the far South, and Van DJK was in the midst of everything, experimenting with fresh content each week. It was a challenging job, but he picked it up quickly. Audiences in New Orleans anticipated swift chuckles and vibrant vitality, and Van DJK provided them with both. In retrospect, that work taught him strategies for surviving live TV. It readied him for the next step. Next, 1954 arrived, and Van DJK's debut on a talent program on national television, a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. ABC broadcast it, and it helped up-and-coming artists gain their begin. Viewers and producers were captivated with Van Dyke's mime act, which was supported by comedy. Similar, he started appearing as a guest on national variety shows such as The Phil the Pat Boone, Chevy, Dealership, and Silver Show. It wasn't long before 2 show producers that he was capable of more than simply mime. 5 years from now, he would depart from Broadway star to guest performer. Such an ascent was unusual. The majority of comedians tried to get there for 10 years. Van Dyke gave it a quick and simple, yet years of quiet practice and menial work went into it. In 1956, everything changed when a friend from Van Dyke's Army days stepped in with an offer. Now, that friend was an SEBS executive. It was successful when he suggested Van Dyke to the network. Van DJK signed a 7-year deal. It wasn't common. Long-term networks did not distribute sales to comedians who haven't achieved national recognition. Van DJK, however, possessed something distinct. He quickly began co-hosting the morning program on CBS. Walter co-hosted the news segment with him. Cronut. The opportunity lasted longer than the show. That agreement was the first actual wager that CBS placed on Van DJK, and it was successful. At the end of 1959, Van DJK reached Broadway. The Girls Against the Boys, his debut performance, debuted in November and ended 2 weeks later, after just 16 shows. It might have gone horribly wrong. The ensemble featured well-known figures like Shelley Berman and Bert L., while Van DJK had a few minor parts. The majority of new actors would have been unnerved by the abrupt end, but Van DJK learned from it. He observed how Broadway operated. He witnessed how easily things may go wrong, and in some way, it didn't cause him to slow down. In April 1960, only 5 months later, he was back on Broadway. As the lead this time, in a recent film, he portrayed Albert F. Peterson. The musical Bye Bye Birdie. The narrative traced a pop star's unexpected military draft that was obviously influenced by Elvis Presley. Van DJK was a dangerous decision. He lacked stage experience, and many questioned his ability to lead a performance. However, he did. The part worked because of his timing, enthusiasm, and awkward charm. He left in less than 6 months. He went from being a supporting actor to the main character. That sort of leap wasn't an accident. You have to earn it. By April of 1961, Van DJK had secured a Tony Award for a musical's finest featured actor. He was 35, only Only 2 years he had been playing supporting parts in a production that had barely survived previews. He was now triumphing over seasoned veterans of Broadway. The honor was more than just a personal triumph. It demonstrated that he belonged on the nation's largest stages. It demonstrated that a previous West Coast club mime act might be coming regarded by New York critics as a top-tier performer. The accomplishment of Birdie's farewell was enormous. Before closing, the musical had 607 performances. October of 1961. One of its 4 Tony Awards was for Best Musical Music, such as put radio hits included on A Happy Face and One Last Kiss. The musical didn't only amuse yourself, it encapsulated an authentic aspect of American existence, the adolescent preoccupation with change, music, and celebrity. Carl Reiner wasn't writing for anybody else when he came up with the concept for the Dick Van DJK show. It was written by him, for himself. At first, it was known as Head of the Family. Additionally, in 1959, he starred him in a pilot that was filmed. The networks, meanwhile, were unimpressed. The program failed to sell. Nevertheless, Sheldon Leonard and Danny, 2 renowned producers, Thomas had faith in the text. Reiner was instructed to let someone else perform the take the lead. Reiner consented, albeit he wasn't very happy. In fact, Leonard stated, "You won't fail. A better actor will be hired to portray you." Dick was that actor. Van DJK had never hosted a television program before. However, after CBS showed the everything changed with the release of the new version. On October 3, 1961, Rob was played by Van Dyke. Reiner's personal life served as the inspiration for the comedy. Writer Petrie, the story, the chemistry, the casting was successful. When Reiner's show almost disappeared, it became into a classic. It was also difficult to cast Mary Tyler Moore as Laura Petrie. She was when she tried out. She was only 23 and hardly known. She had already experienced rejection. After being turned down and nearly missing the audition, Van DJK wasn't even certain she might be amusing. Her accent sounded overly formal, but something clicked the instant they coordinated their actions. She was swift, self-assured, and enhanced each scenario to its full potential. The two turned into the cast became so well coordinated that they began to function as an improv team. They were nearly able to read each other's thoughts. Their performances were lively, authentic, and seemed natural. During the show, Rob and Laura became one of the most adored couples on television. There was nothing off-screen romance, only complete attention to detail in every scenario. Later, they made a joke about although it was a horrible waste, the on-screen magic was preserved by not having an affair, undamaged. Critics and the public took note. The Emmy was given to Dick Van DJK for Exceptional Principal Performer in a Comedy Series for 3 consecutive years, 1964, 1965, as well as 1966. The program itself won in the same years. For exceptional comedic shows, this was unusual. Sitcoms had difficult rivalry, but Van Dyke's performance was particularly noteworthy. He was affable, quick, and humorous, without ever going overboard. The program gained traction. It continued to win, and it continued to gain reputation. With only 158 episodes in barely 5 years, the program won 15 Emmys. Overall, it garnered 24 nominations and 27 victories across major honors. These applied to acting, writing, and the entire series. Winning only at the time, 1 Emmy, was a huge deal. This show was so successful that it broke anticipations. It was still regarded as one of the greatest presentations ever produced by both years later. The Writer Guild and TV Guide. Even after the June premiere of the last episode, the show continued in 1966. New generations learned and reruns continued to play. Laura, Petrie, and Rob. It was among the first sitcoms to maintain their popularity through the use of syndication till the 2000s. Even after starring in Diagnosis, Murder, and Mary Poppins, Van Dyke's performance had such an impact that people initially perceived him as Rob Petrie. The actors, the script, and the harmony between storylines about work and home helped establish it as a template for sitcoms in the future. It also had a passionate and obvious conclusion that increased the story's credibility and contributed to securing its heritage. Van DJK became well known thanks to the Dick Van DJK Show. Although his first significant in 1963, the film Bye Bye, Birdie was released. He had already performed the part on Broadway and received a Tony Award, but the movie elevated it to a much higher level. Viewers, inspired by the era, it blended rock and roll with a light-hearted look at celebrity. Elvis Presley enlisted in the military. In the roles of Albert Peterson and Van DJK, Anne Margaret, a rising star, appeared on the same screen as him. She even received a nomination for a Golden Globe. Specifically, the song Put on a Happy Face turned into one of Van Dyke's defining moments. His talent was even more than people's, according to critics, shown on television. The film demonstrated that he was also capable of bringing musicals to the big screen. Mary Poppins followed in 1964. Van DJK performed in 2 different roles. Many people were unaware that he also played the old bank, but everyone remembers him as Bert, the happy chimney sweeper, manager, senior to Mr. Da. That part nearly didn't come to pass. Walt Disney wasn't confident in the concept. Van DJK promised to spend $4,000 of his personal funds exclusively for the opportunity. He was almost unrecognizable under thick makeup. He was really mentioned in the credits as Navskid Keed, which is an anagram of his own name, Nam. The trick was successful. He was nominated for a Golden Globe and joined of a beloved family movie ever produced. Many years later, he came back in the second installment, in the role of Mr. Da Jr. Additionally, the Mary Poppins soundtrack became an enormous success. It sold more than 2.3 million copies in 1964 alone. In 1968, it had surpassed 6 million. It topped the Billboard album chart for 14 weeks. That was unusual, particularly for a kid-friendly music. It took home the IT won a Grammy for Best Children's Record and became a staple in families' daily lives everywhere. Van DJK performed throughout a number of memorable songs, such as Supercalifragilistic and Chim Chim Cherry-Expialidocious. Walt Disney personally came to love the song, Feed the Birds. He was reportedly requested to have it played in his office once a week. The Oxford Dictionary even acknowledged the impact. Supercalifragilistic expialidocious was added to its list of words.